Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport on a sweltering summer morning. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass panes, bouncing off the polished floors and making the space feel even more glaring and cramped amidst the crowd. Passengers jostled toward Gate AC 2780, bound for Seattle, hauling suitcases, clutching boarding passes, and trying to stay calm amid the chaos before departure. Among them, Elise Hartmann held the hand of her 7-year-old daughter, Lena, walking slowly toward the gate. Elise wore a slightly wrinkled white shirt, her eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. Yet despite the fatigue, she couldn't hide the tenderness in her gaze as she glanced down at her daughter, who was chattering non-stop about all the wonders she was looking forward to in Seattle. Lena, a small girl with brown skin and tightly braided curls adorned with pink hair clips, was bubbling with excitement about snow-covered mountains she'd seen in books, her dream of watching whales in the ocean, and eating mango ice cream in the middle of summer. Her voice chirped like a bright little melody cutting through the weary crowd. "Do you think snow tastes like peppermint, Mommy?" Lena asked, eyes twinkling. Elise let out a soft laugh. "Probably not, sweetheart, but I think we can try peppermint ice cream if you want." Just as they reached Gate 24, the loudspeaker announced the boarding call for the first group of passengers. Their seats were near the front of the Economy Plus cabin, comfortable enough for the long flight, yet close enough for Elise to ask for help if needed. Inside the cabin, Elise gently stowed their carry-on, then helped Lena into the window seat. The girl immediately pressed her face to the glass, fascinated by the luggage carts, spinning engines, and technicians inspecting the aircraft. Elise fastened both their seatbelts, then pulled a comic book and a small box of crayons from her backpack to keep Lena entertained before takeoff. Across the aisle, an older man had already settled into his seat. Victor Meinhardt, perhaps in his early 50s, with carefully combed graying hair, wore a faded gray shirt, a slightly loosened tie, and a suit that had seen better days. His face was rigid, his eyes scanning people with a quiet, simmering displeasure. When Lena giggled at the sight of a tiny squirrel climbing the wing outside, Victor frowned. He cleared his throat, a small act, but laced with an odd, irritated sharpness. Elise turned slightly, instinctively observing him. There was something in his eyes that unsettled her. Cold, empty, and quietly judging. Further back, a tall man was navigating the narrow aisle, looking for his seat. He wore a dark t-shirt and simple jeans, a small backpack slung over one shoulder. His expression was calm, but his eyes moved with quiet precision. This was Eric Schreiber, a former UFOR soldier, veteran of the Balkans and the Middle East. Though long out of uniform, the instincts of survival he'd honed in war zones never truly left him. As Eric passed Victor, their eyes met. Only briefly, just a flicker. But something about the man caught Eric's attention. A chill. Nothing overt, yet unmistakable. It was the kind of tension Eric had learned to recognize. The quiet, dangerous edge of someone about to cause trouble. He moved on, took his seat, and fastened his belt. He glanced out the window, then over to Elise and Lena. The little girl was beaming, pointing at the safety instructions on the seatback screen. Elise gently tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. Victor turned again, his expression openly annoyed. He exhaled loudly, then muttered in a low, grim German, "Children never know how to be quiet." Eric heard it, not directed at anyone in particular, but the tone was unmistakable. He didn't react, not yet, but his eyes had shifted into active awareness. The cabin was small, and he knew too well how fragile safety could be. Sometimes it came down to the right reflex at the right moment. Lena didn't fully understand, but she sensed disapproval. She turned to her mother, face uncertain. "Mom, was I bothering someone?" Elise gently shook her head and pulled her daughter into a soft hug. "No, sweetie, you didn't do anything wrong." But inside, a sense of caution stirred. Elise was not someone prone to panic, but the way that man had looked at her daughter, cold and sharp like an old knife, made her heart instinctively tighten. And so, though the plane had yet to take off, the seeds of something unusual had already begun to stir. The steady roar of the aircraft engines filled the cabin as the Airbus A320 lifted off the runway, soaring into the sky. Inside, most passengers had settled in. Some took the chance to nap, others pulled on headphones to watch a movie, or slowly sipped the juice just handed out by the flight attendants. Elise gently squeezed Lena's hand as the plane climbed. The little girl was glued to the window, her eyes sparkling with awe. "Look, Mommy, it's like a toy city." Elise smiled, her gaze tender. But across the aisle, Victor Meinhardt turned his head, casting a sideways glance at the mother and daughter. This time he said nothing, but the expression on his face was unmistakable. An odd, simmering anger at a child's innocent joy. 2 rows back, Eric appeared to be absorbed in a travel magazine. But he was listening. His instincts, ones that had saved him countless times in war, were whispering that this wasn't just about a glance. He noticed Victor's right hand. The man was holding a paper cup of coffee from the flight crew, but his fingers were clenched so tightly that the cup had begun to crumple. His eyes never lingered on Lena for more than a few seconds at a time, but every giggle, every soft comment from the girl made the muscles in his face twitch. Elise could feel it too. Every time she turned toward her daughter, she caught Victor staring. Not with curiosity or irritation, but with a gaze like cold steel, harboring something unspoken. She tried to convince herself she was just being overly sensitive. Still, the unease quietly grew inside her. Lena, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware. She was coloring a small dragon in her cartoon book. "Mommy, should I use purple or green for the wings?" Elise smiled gently. "Purple. Make it special." Just as Lena giggled and began to color, Victor leaned slightly into the aisle and muttered, this time louder, "Please." Some silence would be nice. His voice wasn't raised, but it was sharp enough for Elise to hear clearly. She turned her head, eyes calm but firm. "She hasn't done anything wrong, sir." Victor didn't reply. He merely smirked, a cold, thin-lipped smile, and looked away. At that moment, Eric slowly lowered the magazine. He was done pretending. His eyes sharpened, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't plan to intervene, not yet. There was no reason on record. But he knew all too well. Sometimes, if you waited until something became clear, you were already too late. Elise leaned down and whispered to Lena, "Keep coloring, sweetheart. Mommy's right here." She didn't want her daughter to sense anything, but the tension in her eyes was impossible to hide from Victor. The cabin air began to feel heavier. Not because of altitude, but because of Victor's presence, like a stone dropped into still water. Other nearby passengers seemed to notice it too. An older woman glanced at Victor, then looked away, her brow furrowed. A young flight attendant passed by, her eyes briefly meeting Elise's in a silent question. "Are you okay?" Eric stood up. He stretched casually, like a man needing to ease stiff legs, then strolled down the aisle and paused near Elise and Lena as if by chance. When their eyes met, Elise gave a small nod, a silent thank you. No words were exchanged. None were needed. They both understood. As Eric returned to his seat, Victor's eyes followed him, narrowing. A shift occurred. He grew more restless. His fingers tapped a rhythm on the armrest. His gaze flicked constantly between Elise and Eric. No one knew what Victor was thinking. But Eric understood one thing perfectly. Men like him, the kind who let hatred ferment too long, often only needed the smallest excuse to explode. A glance, a word, a harmless child's laugh. And he wasn't going to let that happen. The hum of the Airbus engines had faded into a constant, dull background in Elise's mind. She was trying to read a few lines from her book to distract herself, but her eyes kept drifting toward the man across the aisle. Victor was no longer just watching. He was reacting deliberately. Every time Lena spoke or laughed softly, he rolled his eyes, shook his head, or frowned. His gestures weren't large, but each one chipped away at the piece of the cabin like a dull knife scraping at the surface. Lena was no longer as carefree as before. She had begun to speak in a quieter voice, sit up straighter, her expression wary, like a child sensing something was off. Elise saw it, and the quiet anger of a mother began to rise inside her. Victor called the flight attendant for the second time, asking for another black coffee. His tone was dry, impatient, his eyes accusatory, as if even the act of being served was a burden. When the cup was handed over, he muttered, "Can't believe they let kids babble on like that for the entire flight." The flight attendant hesitated, her expression faltering for a moment. She glanced briefly at Elise and Lena, then nodded mechanically and walked away without a word. Eric saw it all. He slowly removed his headphones, placing them on the tray table. His shoulders remained relaxed, but his arms were now crossed, his thumb tapping rhythmically against his bicep, a beat that might have been time or patience. He quietly unlocked his phone. Not to make a call, there was no signal, but to be ready to record if it came to that. No one wanted drama on a flight, but if a line was crossed, evidence would matter most. Just then, Lena dropped a crayon. It rolled under her seat and toward Victor's feet. Elise leaned forward to retrieve it, offering a calm apology. "Sorry, it's just my daughter's crayon." But Victor didn't answer. He simply pulled his feet back and gave Elise a look of undisguised contempt. His lip curled, and he muttered just loud enough, "Filthy." Elise looked up. Something inside her cracked. She placed a hand gently on her daughter's shoulder, then turned fully to face him. Her voice was calm, but edged with steel. "You don't get to speak about her like that. She's just a child. Aren't you the adult here?" Victor tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "And you think you get to tell me how to behave? People like you always playing the victim." Eric stood. He moved slowly, without urgency, down the aisle to Elise's row. The air grew taut, like a wire drawn too tight. A few passengers began to take notice. An older woman frowned. A middle-aged man took off his headphones. "Is there a problem here?" Eric asked, his voice low but clear. Victor met his gaze with open defiance. "None of your business. I'm just asking for some peace and quiet." Eric's face didn't change. He looked at Victor for a long moment, then spoke, measured. "Peace doesn't mean harassing others. You're making people uncomfortable. And that little girl did nothing to deserve your insults." Victor gave a short, bitter laugh. "Another soldier playing the hero? How original." "Not a hero," Eric replied. "Just someone who knows when to step in." A temporary silence fell over the cabin. A flight attendant arrived quickly, spotting Eric standing and speaking in calm tones. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, concern in her voice. Elise opened her mouth to reply, but Eric raised a hand gently, keeping his eyes on Victor. "Nothing serious, just that this passenger is making things difficult for a mother and her child. I think it would be wise for the crew to keep an eye on him." The flight attendant nodded, her gaze shifting from Eric to Victor. She then turned to Elise. "If you're uncomfortable, we can arrange for different seating." "No," Elise said firmly. "My daughter and I don't need to move because someone else forgot how to behave." A few passengers around them nodded in quiet agreement. No one spoke loudly, but the silent support added weight to her stance. Victor sank back into his seat, but his eyes darkened. His silence didn't comfort Eric. It was the kind of silence that waits. Eric returned to his seat, but he never looked away from Victor for the rest of the flight. The tension had surfaced. The fragile line between words and action, between discontent and violence, Eric knew had been crossed. Now it was only a matter of when. The airplane cabin was bathed in soft overhead light. Some passengers had drifted off to sleep, others were lost in their books or watching the small screens in front of them. But in seats 9A and 9B, Elise and Lena couldn't find peace. Lena sat curled tightly against her mother, clutching a red stuffed fox a flight attendant had given her. She wasn't crying, but her wide eyes stared out the window, avoiding everyone, especially the man across the aisle. Victor Meinhardt remained there, stiff as stone, his hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. He must have known everyone was watching him, but rather than feeling shame or backing down, Victor seemed to bristle even more under the sense of being challenged. Eric Schreiber hadn't taken his eyes off him. From the moment he sat back down, he had been watching every twitch, every shift. Real-world combat had taught him this. The most dangerous men weren't the ones who shouted, they were the ones who went quiet. Suddenly, the plane entered a patch of light turbulence. The seatbelt sign came on, followed by the captain's calm voice over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mild bumps ahead. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants stopped serving and moved to check on passengers before heading to the rear of the cabin. At that moment, Lena tugged gently at Elise's sleeve. Mom, I dropped my crayon. Elise looked down. A sky-blue crayon had rolled across the floor right beneath Victor's feet. She hesitated, then whispered, Stay in your seat, sweetie. I'll get it. She bent forward to reach for it, but before she could touch it, Victor suddenly moved and kicked the crayon further away, deliberately. Elise froze, stunned. Really mature, Victor muttered, not even looking at her. Elise exhaled slowly, trying to stay composed. Why would you do that? You expect me to fetch a crayon for your noisy brat? Victor sneered. You don't find her annoying? Lena heard it. She immediately shrank back in her seat. Eric was already on his feet, moving swiftly down the aisle. That's enough, he said. His voice was low, but it cut through the cabin like a bell. I haven't done anything, Victor snapped. I'm sitting in my seat. It's her and the kid Hoosh. Before he could finish, Lena reached for the crayon, accidentally brushing against Victor's leg. In that instant, something snapped in him. Get away from me! Victor roared and, without warning, swung his arm. The blow landed on Lena's shoulder and grazed her head. It wasn't hard, but for a 7-year-old it was enough. Lena tumbled into her mother's arms, crying out in pain. The cabin exploded in sound. Are you insane? Elise screamed. He just hit a kid, someone else shouted. Eric lunged forward. Without hesitation, he grabbed Victor's wrist, twisted it behind his back, and forced him down into his seat. You don't touch her again, Eric growled, his voice molten steel. Victor thrashed and shouted, but Eric held him firm. A flight attendant ran over. Behind her, the lead flight attendant appeared, pulling flex cuffs from a kid. Passengers were standing up, filming on their phones. Everyone stay calm, the lead attendant called. The captain and ground authorities have been notified. But Victor kept screaming, hurling foul language, some of it racial slurs, aimed at Elise and Lena. Eric didn't flinch. He tightened his hold just enough to restrain, not to harm. You're destroying yourself, he said, in a voice terrifyingly calm. Elise clutched her daughter tightly, Lena trembling in her arms. The girl's cheeks were red, streaked with tears. A nearby passenger handed over tissues. Another leaned in and whispered, We saw it. We've got video. The plane began descending rapidly. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Due to a security incident, we are making an emergency landing in Denver. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. The air felt unstable inside the plane as much as outside it. Eric stayed beside Victor, who was now restrained by a second male passenger, a strong-built man who stepped forward to assist. As the crew secured Victor's arms to the seat with plastic ties, the man kept lashing out verbally until he finally ran out of breath. The descent continued. Elise sat silently, arms wrapped around her daughter. Lena had stopped crying, but her small body still shook with quiet sobs. Eric sat just behind them, his eyes never leaving their row. The flight hadn't ended, but the silence that fell over the cabin had become something new, a silent vow. Everyone understood now, this wasn't just words. This wasn't just tension. It was hatred made action. And today, someone had dared to stop it. The plane touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport in the late afternoon. The sky wore a soft gray hue and the breeze from the Pacific Ocean was cool and gentle, as if the city itself had opened its arms to welcome the three people who had just lived through a nightmare. Elise gripped Lena's hand as they stepped off the jet bridge. The girl no longer recoiled as she had before, but her eyes still darted about, constantly scanning. Eric walked beside them, silent, not too close, but never too far. His quiet presence gave Elise something she hadn't felt in days, steadiness. They said little after leaving the airport. The airline had arranged a hotel near downtown for Elise and her daughter, along with a formal apology. Elise accepted with polite detachment. There was no room left in her for anger or gratitude. All she wanted was some peace. 3 days passed. Seattle greeted them with light rain, damp sidewalks, and the sound of trams clattering past intersections. Elise and Lena stayed mostly in the hotel. The girl slowly returned to some routines, cereal for breakfast, cartoons, coloring. But she no longer chattered while she drew. She would often pause mid-stroke, staring off into space. One day, Elise asked gently, "Why are you finishing your drawing?" Lena answered in a whisper, "I'm scared if I laugh, someone might hate me again." Elise pulled her daughter close, holding her tightly. She didn't know what to say, only whispered. No one has the right to make you feel that way. At night, Lena still woke up in fear, sometimes crying. Is he coming back? No, sweetheart, Elise answered every time. We're safe now. On the fourth day, Elise received a call from the Denver District Attorney's Office. Victor Meinhardt had been formally charged with 3 counts, assault of a minor, public disturbance, and a hate crime. We'll need you and Lena to return to Denver within the next 2 weeks to provide official testimony, the case officer explained. And we're hoping for full cooperation from the witness, Eric Schreiber. After the call, Elise messaged Eric. Elise, they called. We have to go back to Denver. Eric, I've been contacted. I'll be there. Elise, I don't know if Lena can handle it, but I can't stay silent. Not this time. Eric, that's how we stop him. And protect other kids. The next day, a video clip from Flight AC-2780 began circulating on social media. It captured Victor's outburst, Lena's cries, Elise's firm voice, and Eric pinning the man's arm, everything. The media picked it up instantly. News outlets reached out to the airline, Victor's lawyer, and eventually found Elise. A local news anchor left a message at the hotel front desk. We want to hear from you. You are not alone. People are listening. At first, Elise hesitated. But then she remembered Lena's question. Did I do something wrong? No, she hadn't. And if there was a way to help the world understand that, Elise had to take it. She agreed to a limited interview on her terms, no filming Lena, no intrusive questions, and no turning the story into entertainment. When the camera rolled, Elise sat tall, hands clenched tightly, voice trembling slightly, but her eyes never flinched. My name is Elise Hartman. I'm Lena's mother. And I'm here to say what we all know but rarely say out loud. Racism doesn't only happen on the news. It happens in seat 9A right beside a 7-year-old girl on a flight that was supposed to be safe. In that moment, Elise was no longer a victim. She was a voice. She was the one who stood up. At the end of the interview, the reporter asked, "What made you speak up?" Elise paused. Then she said, "Because I saw the moment my daughter learned to be afraid of adults. And because one man, a stranger, didn't look away. They stopped recording." Elise walked back toward the room where Lena waited. In the hallway, she passed Eric, who stood by the window, quietly watching the news on his phone, the interview already airing. He looked at her. He didn't speak. He just nodded once. Elise returned the look, not a thank you, but a deep mutual understanding. For the first time in a long while, she felt something return. Hope. Denver, Colorado, an early fall morning. Cool air seeped through the courthouse's glass panes. Yellow leaves gathered along the walkways. Elise stepped out of the police vehicle, holding Lena's trembling hand. Eric, in a white shirt and gray jacket, stood beside them, silent but unshakable. Lena wore a pale purple dress, clutching her worn stuffed fox. Though visibly anxious, she held her head high. Elise had told her, "We're not here because we're scared. We're here so no one else has to be." Inside the courthouse, the assistant DA, Rachel Donovan, reviewed files. Young, sharp-eyed, and calm, she welcomed them with a nod. "We have solid video evidence from 3 passengers," she said. "We just need you to confirm details. Lena can either testify in person or give a recorded statement." "Eric, we prefer your live testimony." Eric nodded. "I'm ready." Rachel knelt to Lena's level. "Lena, I'm here to listen to you. No yelling. No scary faces." "Okay." Lena was silent for a moment. Then softly, "I'll try." In the courtroom, Victor Meinhardt sat at the defendant's table, no longer in a suit but a drab prison uniform. His hair was unkempt, his face hollow. But his eyes, still sharp, still bitter. When Elise entered, Victor smirked faintly. She ignored it, shoulders straight, and took her place at the witness stand. Eric sat in the back row near a deputy. He appeared relaxed, but his posture was that of a soldier in a new kind of war, a war of truth. Elise testified first. "My daughter and I boarded the flight early that morning. She was excited for our trip. We sat in seats 9A and 9B. At first, everything seemed normal, but the man across the aisle, Mr. Meinhardt, was visibly annoyed whenever my daughter laughed or spoke. She recounted it all. Every glance. Every muttered insult. The blow clear, deliberate, not accidental. He struck her on the shoulder and head. My daughter. A 7-year-old child. The defense lawyer objected. Subjective interpretation. The prosecutor responded. We have video of the incident. It will be presented following testimony. The judge nodded. Eric was called next. As he stood, the room seemed to still. Tall, composed, with a piercing gaze, Eric brought a quiet weight with him. But his voice surprised them. It was calm, even gentle. I've served in peacekeeping forces. I've seen many small tensions become dangerous. From the beginning, I noticed the tone, the words, the threats. I hoped it would stop. But when he struck that child, I knew I couldn't stay seated. Did you hear anything the defendant said during the incident? The prosecutor asked. Yes. Offensive racially charged remarks. I've heard them before. No one accidentally says things like that. The defense objected again. The video was then played. Lena's cries. Elise shouting. Victor yelling. You people always make everything worse. Eric's voice. Don't touch the girl again. Silence filled the courtroom. The judge spoke quietly. The court will proceed with charges based on today's evidence and testimony. When they left, Elise felt lightheaded. But when Lena turned to her and asked, Mom, did I do something wrong? Elise knelt and looked her in the eyes. No, sweetheart. You were brave. And because of you, a lot of people won't stay silent anymore. Behind them, Eric's stern face softened. He knew justice mattered, but so did knowing you're not alone. There was still a long road ahead. But today, they had taken a step together. 3 weeks later, the courtroom lit up again for sentencing. The atmosphere was calmer but charged with anticipation. The seats were full, reporters, advocates, and even some passengers from Flight AC 2780. Elise sat beside her attorney, holding Lena's hand. Eric, composed in a dark suit, waited near the witness section. They didn't look at Victor, now in full prison attire, eyes sunken, defeated. The judge's voice rang out. After reviewing the evidence, testimony, and aggravating factors related to racial hostility, the court sentences Victor Meinhardt to 2 years in prison for assaulting a minor, 6 additional months for public disturbance, and 1 year suspended for hate crime conduct, totaling 3.5 years. He is further required to undergo bias re-education and mandatory psychological evaluation during his sentence. Victor didn't react. No rage. No remorse. Just disbelief, as though he couldn't understand how someone like him had ended up here. The judge lowered his voice. This court doesn't only judge actions but consequences, especially the emotional harm done to a child. No one should be afraid simply because they are different. A few people in the courtroom nodded solemnly. Elise's lawyer touched her shoulder. We did it. Outside, reporters waited. Elise said nothing. She didn't need to. The story had already spoken. Before leaving, she turned to Eric. Do you regret anything? He shook his head. I used to think life after the army would be quiet. But if quiet means watching evil happen, I'd rather step in. Elise smiled, her first real smile in weeks. Lena whispered. Uncle Eric, will you still write to me? Eric crouched, his smile gentle. I promise. And next time I'll send you a bigger fox. Lena laughed. This time it was real. Weeks later, life slowly returned to rhythm. Elise brought Lena back to school. At first shy, she began regaining confidence with help from a kind teacher and caring classmates. She spoke of Eric like a real-life superhero. Eric resumed his work teaching self-defense to women and children at a Seattle community center. One day, he received a package, a drawing from Lena of a small girl and a tall man standing under a blue sky, neatly written underneath. I'm not scared anymore. Thank you. Eric stared at it for a long time. He didn't reply with words. He sent back a card that read, I didn't save you. I just reminded you that you were brave all along. That autumn, Elise attended a community storytelling night at Lena's school. She was invited to speak. She didn't share flight details. She didn't name Victor. She only said, what hurts us doesn't always come from one act, but from the silence around it. And what heals us often starts with just one person willing to speak up. The room fell still. From the front row, Lena turned and looked at her mother, her eyes bright and clear. The storm had passed. And the sky ahead, still with clouds, was at last one they had the power to fly through together.